There's a house in a quiet suburb somewhere in America, and nothing about it stands out.
Mid-size, well-maintained. The kind of lawn that says someone has time on weekends, but not a landscaper. The couple who lives there drove the same two cars for 11 years, and they took vacations but drove to them. They said no to things, constantly, quietly, without ever making a big deal about it. And last year, somewhere in their early 60s, their net worth crossed $1 million. Their neighbors had no idea, and that's the part people find genuinely surprising when they first hear it. Not that it happened, but that it happened invisibly, with no IPO, no inheritance, no business exit. Just two people with ordinary jobs, ordinary paychecks, and a set of decisions nobody applauded them for making. When researchers actually study people who became millionaires on average salaries, what they find doesn't look like the financial content you've been fed. There's no secret investment, no perfectly timed market call, and what they find looks almost boring. And that boringness, it turns out, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Here's the belief that most working Americans carry around, usually without ever examining it directly. Wealth is primarily an income problem. And if you're not building meaningful wealth, it's because you're not earning enough. And if you were earning more, really earning more, the wealth would follow naturally over time. Income goes up, options expand, money accumulates. And that's how it works, right? Except the data keeps complicating that story in ways that are worth taking seriously. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances is probably the most comprehensive look we have at what American households actually own, owe, and earn.
And when you dig into that data, what you find is that the relationship between income and wealth is a lot messier than most people assume. There are people earning $150,000 a year with almost nothing saved, and that pattern shows up consistently. And there are people who spent their careers at $65,000 who quietly crossed into millionaire territory over time. The income isn't the cleanest predictor, and the spread between income and spending is, and that gap is a behavioral variable. So the real question isn't what did these people earn, it's what did they actually do differently, and why? Let's start with what the income assumption gets right, because it does get some things right. Higher income genuinely does make wealth accumulation easier, and that's not a controversial point at all. If you're earning $200,000 a year, the math on saving 15% is a lot more forgiving. You have more margin for error, and you can absorb an unexpected car repair without derailing your savings rate for 3 months. You can max a retirement account and still have room to live well, because income creates options. And the cultural story around high earners builds on this in ways that feel completely logical to most people. The people who earn the most seem to accumulate the most, so the inference becomes that earning more is the path. The problem with this inference is survivorship and what researchers call lifestyle inflation, or sometimes lifestyle creep. What we notice are the high earners who built wealth, and what we don't naturally notice are the high earners who didn't. A person earning $220,000 who spends $215,000 doesn't become a cautionary tale. They just quietly never get there, and they look completely fine from the outside for a very long time. And lifestyle creep isn't a character flaw, it's almost a structural feature of how income growth tends to work. You get a raise, and the apartment you were fine in starts to feel small almost immediately. The car that was perfectly adequate starts to feel a little embarrassing at client dinners, and spending adjusts gradually. Friends who earn what you earn now go on different vacations, eat at different restaurants, and the comparison is constant. The spending adjusts naturally, without any single decision that feels irresponsible, and before long, the savings rate has barely moved. That's not a hypothetical.
It's one of the more consistent patterns in the behavioral finance literature. Here's where average salary millionaires tend to diverge from the crowd, and it's not where most people expect to find the difference. It's not that they're extreme frugalists who never go to a restaurant or drive a decent car. The research portrait of the actual average salary millionaire is surprisingly normal looking in most lifestyle dimensions.
What's different is something more structural and more psychological than most people assume when they first hear this story. The first divergence is in their relationship to spending decisions and social comparison, which shows up consistently in the data. Behavioral researchers have spent decades studying what they call identity-based consumption. The purchases we make not because we want the thing itself. We make them because of what owning the thing signals about who we are to the people around us. The premium car that's really about a professional identity. The neighborhood chosen to signal arrival. The renovation driven by a neighbor's renovation. These aren't irrational decisions in a social sense, but they're expensive and invisible as a category of spending.
We don't experience them as status purchases. We experience them as just living our lives and making reasonable choices. Average salary millionaires tend to show a lower sensitivity to this mechanism. Not zero sensitivity, but meaningfully lower. They're less likely to upgrade automatically when income increases, and more likely to maintain a stable spending identity as earnings grow. And that stability is worth an enormous amount over time, because it means their savings rate doesn't erode as they earn more. The gap stays open, and it's that gap, income minus spending, that's doing the actual wealth building work year after year. The second divergence is structural, and these are people who overwhelmingly pay themselves first, not as a concept, but as a system. Retirement contributions, savings transfers, investment contributions, all of it automated. All of it occurring before discretionary spending ever begins. This sounds almost too simple to be significant, but behavioral research consistently shows that friction between intention and action is a major obstacle. When the decision is made once and the system is built, the willpower requirement drops to near zero. You can't spend what you never see, and that single operational reality changes the entire trajectory over decades. The third divergence is their relationship to time, and it's the one that surprises people the most when they hear it. Not impatience in the dramatic sense, but something quieter, a genuine long-term orientation that allows them to hold a boring investment through a market drop. They delay a lifestyle upgrade for another few years without feeling deprived, and they resist a spending decision because they've already claimed that money for their future. Researchers who study delay of gratification in adults find that people who score higher on this dimension save more consistently. They carry less consumer debt, are more likely to pay credit card balances in full, and report higher financial satisfaction overall. It's not about white-knuckling through temptation. It's about having a sufficiently vivid and valued future that the trade-off feels worthwhile. Now let's put some shape to what these behavioral differences actually produce over time, using a modeled scenario grounded in realistic assumptions. Assume two people, both earning $70,000 a year, which is close to the median full-time wage, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Both are 30 years old, both plan to retire at 65, and the only difference between them is their savings rate. Person A saves 6% of gross income, which is around what many people default to when matching an employer contribution. Person B saves 18%, which is meaningfully higher than average, but not extreme for someone who has made this a deliberate priority. At an assumed long-run real return of 6% annually, and that is an assumption and not a guarantee, the outcomes diverge significantly. Person A ends up at roughly $500,000 in real terms by retirement, which is not nothing, but also not comfortable for a long retirement. Person B, saving 18%, ends up closer to $1.5 million in real terms at the same retirement age. Same salary, same market, same job, and roughly 3 times the outcome from one variable held consistently over time. By year 10, the difference between person A and person B is meaningful, but not jaw-dropping, maybe $60,000 or $70,000. By year 20, the gap is more like $200,000 to $250,000. Significant, but still not the full picture. By year 35, the gap is roughly $1 million in real purchasing power from one decision made at 30 and held consistently. This is what compound growth actually looks like from the inside. Almost nothing for the first decade, and then it starts to feel real. It looks like a different life at year 35. But the problem is that most people evaluate financial decisions based on how they feel in year 2. And in year 2, the 18% saver and the 6% saver look almost identical from the outside. Same neighborhood, similar cars. The divergence is invisible until it isn't. And by then, the gap is too large to close quickly. Large-scale surveys of U.S. millionaires have found that for those who accumulated wealth through steady saving and investing, the average accumulation period was roughly 3 decades. Not a dramatic arc, just a long, quiet, unremarkable arc that looks completely ordinary until the last chapter of the story. Now, let's be genuinely honest about the limits of this picture, because there's a version of this story that gets told in a subtly dishonest way. The behavioral framework, save more, spend less, build systems, hold long-term, is real and evidence-backed, but it carries an implicit assumption. That assumption is that your income is stable and sufficient to create a gap between what you earn and what you spend. That you have access to an employer retirement plan, and that a medical event or job loss doesn't reset the clock entirely. For a significant number of American households, those assumptions simply don't hold, and the advice, while technically correct, becomes practically hollow. If you're earning $40,000 in a high cost of living city with dependents, the gap isn't a behavioral problem, it's a math problem. And no amount of delayed gratification fixes a budget that doesn't have enough room to save in the first place. So the honest version of this story is not that anyone can do this if they just develop the right psychology. The honest version is that these behavioral and structural habits produce dramatically better outcomes for people in a position to deploy them. And the people who built these habits often had access to something that made those habits feasible: consistent work and affordable housing. They also had employer-sponsored retirement accounts and a period of economic history that rewarded steady index investing with genuinely strong returns. But the psychology is real, and the structural prerequisites are also real. And both of those things are true at the same time. Here's the thing that stays with me when I look at all of this data together and try to find the one insight that matters. The gap between the average person and the average salary millionaire isn't primarily measured in dollars earned. It's measured in decisions made without an audience. Decisions to keep the savings rate where it was when the raise came through and to hold the investment when the market dropped 30%. Decisions to let another year go by without the kitchen renovation. Not glamorous decisions. Not the kind anyone posts about anywhere. What these people figured out is that wealth on an ordinary income is less a destination and more a rate at which you're traveling. You don't feel it accumulating the same way you feel a bonus or a windfall, and it doesn't announce itself along the way. It just runs quietly in the background while life happens in the foreground, year after year, decade after decade. And the question worth sitting with the next time you make a spending decision is this one. Just one simple clarifying question. Am I spending this money because I actually want what it buys, or because I want what it signals to the people around me? That's not a judgment. It's just a clarifying question. And the people who ask it regularly tend to end up somewhere very different.
If you want to go one level deeper on the mechanics of how this actually compounds at different income levels and savings rates, that's the logical next place to go.
And if this kind of calm, data-grounded look at how money actually works is useful to you, subscribing means you'll see the next one when it comes out.